Hey guys, what's up? It's time to revise. Today we're going to be looking at issues and debates. It's going to be gender and culture bias. Let's do it. There you go, look, there are some exam style questions. You've got timings, you've got marks. Off you go. Pause the video, give it a go. Come back when you're ready for me to talk through. Alright, let's do it. So we want to explain the term universality here. If it were just a one marker, I'd be saying something brief along the lines of universality is the view that behaviour is the same for everyone, everywhere. Yeah, universal, universe, think about it like that if that helps. Because this is a two marker, I want to give a little bit more than that. So I might say, therefore it's appropriate to make generalisations between people or across groups. Alright. Now I want to show some application skill because it says referring to a topic of study. And I want to explain the term cultural relativism. Well, cultural relativism is broadly about the idea that different cultures have different behaviours, and we can't generalise between cultures. That might get me 1 mark, so I'm going to elaborate by saying something along the lines of, it's the view that a culture or a culture's behaviour can only really be understood from within that cultural context, from within the context of the attitudes or the conventions of that culture. Yeah. Now I want to hit that application element as well to get that 3rd mark. And I could make a comment about, I think attachment comes to mind when you're talking about culture bias. So that final sentence could be something along the lines of, for example, cross-cultural studies of attachment have shown that Japanese families, for example, or Japanese infants, tend to be judged as resistant within the strange situation. However, this is actually a norm for their parenting culture because children are not separated very often from their parents. So it doesn't make sense, or it's not fair to judge them outside of that context. Right, now we want to explain 2 ways in which psychologists might avoid gender bias in their research. This isn't really about defining gender bias. It's not about defining alpha or beta bias or anything like that. It's specifically how am I going to get around gender bias, yeah? So, a bit of common sense. You can get credit just for saying things like, well, you're not going to generalise from, for example, males to females or females to males, yeah? So only make conclusions or generalisations within the gender that you've studied. What else could we say? Well, we could say that we need to study the genders separately, or we could include a mixed sample even, because then if you get a certain behaviour emerging from that group and you've used a range of genders, then surely we can generalise that back out to a range of genders. Yeah. So you could talk about the actual sample and not generalising from a single gender sample. You can also talk about things like reflexivity or feminist psychology. So trying to conduct research that is more in line with the needs and the specific research interests that apply to women, so that you're trying to kind of address that gap and make sure that you're not guilty of, for example, beta bias there, because you're paying special attention to behaviours that might be specific to women. Okay. Right, now we've got a STEM, bit of application. We've got Sage and Jalen who are talking about an article they've read. So if we have a look through what Sage says about this article, it seems like she's, or they're looking at a study where we've got 50 female participants, they're listening to a speech, half of them can see the person that's talking, half can't, and they've been asked to try and remember this speech, and the ones that could see the speaker remembered better. Okay, and Sage says, that's interesting, right? Maybe people listen more if they have that visual element. Fine. Okay. It could be, yeah, says Jalen, but I doubt that they'd find the same thing with men. Women are far better at listening. So the question specifically talks about alpha and beta bias, and if we break down what Sage and Jalen are saying, Jalen is very against making any kind of generalization from this study, and Jalen is saying that males and females are very different in terms of listening. So that's feeling like alpha bias to me. Remember, alpha bias is the one that is exaggerating differences between groups. Yeah, so it's making differences bigger. yeah? Big, think like the alpha, yeah? Big, okay. Sage, on the other hand, hasn't really picked up on the fact that possibly, this is a biased sample, and the fact that it's all women. Sage is saying, okay, well, maybe people listen more. So we're going from women to people, and not recognizing that males and females might behave differently. So that would seem to be beta bias. So that's where your application is going to go for that one. In terms of the knowledge, I've already said about alpha bias. Well, beta bias is the one where we are minimizing or ignoring or overlooking differences between groups. Yeah. So you're going to talk through the knowledge of what those types of bias are. You're going to link to the STEM and explain why that's alpha bias or why that's beta bias. Okay. Right, now we've got an 8 marker to discuss ways of dealing with culture bias in psychology. And the focus here isn't so much on alpha and beta bias, it's on how we're going to get around some of this bias. So if I was tackling this in terms of those knowledge marks, I'd be talking more about things like indigenous psychology, so where we are trying to work with psychologists with a certain cultural background and get their views and allow them to study their own culture, kind of thing. Or I'd be talking about reflexivity, so trying to be aware of and open to your own bias and try to include this in your report. I might mention taking an emic approach and trying to derive the value from a culture from within rather than to judge a culture from say an external standard, push our own values on another culture. So that's where I'd go knowledge-wise in terms of describing those ways of dealing with culture bias. And I think the discussion is about how effective are these actually dealing with culture bias. So let's take reflexivity, for example. One of the strengths of taking a more reflexive approach is that it means that some modern research maybe isn't so culture biased because we've got researchers discussing their own backgrounds and some views on, are they biased and should you generalize from their work and all this sort of thing. So maybe that's a really good thing for modern psychology. However, I think the development here and the counter argument to that is just because people are saying, I've got whatever white background, I'm from the UK or whatever, just because people are saying that doesn't automatically mean that that bias is going to go away. And when we think about a lot of bias is actually unconscious. So I would argue that reflexivity is only a partial solution to culture bias. And let's take another example. We mentioned, taking an emic approach or even indigenous psychology. Well, yes, okay. The discussion might be about one of the good things is that we're going to maybe avoid some of the negative implications of culture bias. And you could even reference an example, something like we mentioned the strange situation and cultural variation research in attachment. You could say we're going to avoid some of those negative implications. But the counter argument to that is that all this discussion about difference and not generalizing actually maybe causes us to overlook similarity. Yeah? Supporters of the universalist perspective, we talked about universalism earlier, supporters of that perspective would argue that actually we've got a lot more in common than we have different. And this focus on not making generalizations might lead us to miss some important chances to maybe celebrate the similarities that we have, or even just do further research. So I think that's how I tackle that as an 8 marker. A bit of knowledge on the methods to deal with bias, and then a couple of discussion paragraphs about how effective they are. Okay, so let's talk about how we're going to make this into a 16 marker. Now, the focus here isn't necessarily on how you would deal with gender or culture bias, but I think you could still work a lot of what we've discussed in. So, breaking this down, I don't think I would do a 16 marker just on gender or a 16 marker just on culture, but obviously looking at that question, you could do. It gives you the choice. I'd be tempted, I think, to almost think of it as kind of 2 8 markers and maybe do a bit of knowledge of gender bias, so explain what gender bias is and explain what alpha and beta bias are, and then maybe 2 discussion paragraphs, maybe one talking about the negative implications of gender bias, thinking about the fact that maybe it perpetuates stereotypes, it's got negative consequences, it often leads to the devaluing of women in society. You could even make a more economic argument and bring in maybe some of Bowlby's work and how that maybe forced women out of the workplace or whatever you want to do with that. But I think, as I said, I'd have a discussion paragraph there about the implications and then a discussion paragraph about how maybe we could get around gender bias and maybe maybe it's not so much of an issue in modern psychology because we're starting to be more reflective, and we're starting to, support a lot more kind of feminist psychology and all these different things. And then for the second half of this 16 marker, I think I'd do the same thing but with culture bias. So maybe explain what culture bias is, explaining what alpha and beta bias are in the context of culture, maybe even define the term cultural relativism in there, and then have a couple of discussion paragraphs, a bit like what we've just done with gender. So what are the implications? Again, you could reference the strange situation there if you want to have an example to talk about or to help you to explain the implications. And then a discussion paragraph about how we might deal with culture bias, and a discussion about, is culture bias still such an issue in modern psychology as it was 20, 30, 40 years ago? Of course it is still an issue, but the discussion is about these modern ways of trying to prevent or avoid culture bias, like reflexivity and indigenous psychology. All right, that's how I would tackle that anyway. I think, like I said, I wouldn't try and do a 16 marker just on one or the other. I very much would take AQA up on their offer of covering both there. Okay, time to reflect. I do think gender and culture bias is tricky. In fact, I think issues and debates is one of the trickiest topics. One of the most interesting in a way, but I think it is a tricky topic. And gender and culture, I think, are some of the hardest bits of that. So if you found that tough, I get it, and that's fine. But reflect on how that's gone, and how is that going to feed back into your next steps. Okay, so that was me discussing some possible questions on gender and culture bias for issues and debates, paper 3, AQA Psych. Let me know how you got on with that. How do you find issues and debates? Do you like it? I think some people love it. I think my perception is that the majority don't, but let me know in the comments how you find it. All right, I hope that was helpful for you guys. Cheers. See you again soon.